What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
You ever had one of those moments where you're so blindsided by someone's audacity that your brain just pauses? Like it takes a second to catch up with what just happened? That was me, standing in my parents' living room on my birthday, watching my mom and dad hand my younger brother Kyle the keys to a brand new car. Everyone around us was clapping, even my aunt who has arthritis and can't usually clap more than twice in a row, and there I was, smiling like a robot while my stomach felt like it was being slowly twisted into knots. They were going on and on about how proud they were of him, how he deserved this after everything he's been through, and my brain was screaming, wait a damn second, isn't today supposed to be about me? But on the outside, I clapped politely, because I've had 38 years of practice pretending not to notice the favoritism in this family. I should have seen it coming, honestly. My parents have always been like this with Kyle. If he breathes in and out without falling over, they act like he cured cancer. Meanwhile, I could work 2 jobs, pay my own rent since I was 19, never ask them for a dime, and they'd barely blink. But this was a new level. They didn't just overshadow my birthday, they basically hijacked it. And the worst part was, everyone in the room acted like it was normal. No one seemed to think it was weird that the guest of honor was just standing there, holding a paper plate with cold potato salad on it, while her little brother got a life-changing gift. When they finally stopped fussing over Kyle, my mom turned toward me with this big smile, the kind you use when you're trying to make someone feel special, but don't actually mean it. She handed me an envelope, and for a split second, I thought, okay, maybe they got me a check, maybe they booked a trip for me, maybe there's something in here that shows I'm more than just the side character in my own life. But then I opened it. Inside was a coupon book, not like a store coupon book with real value, but one they'd made themselves. Little perforated slips of paper with handwritten notes like one free hug from dad and good for one home-cooked meal from mom. There was even one that said, I'll help you move, just kidding, call Kyle, like it was a damn joke. And everyone around me laughed when I flipped through it, because apparently the idea of a grown woman being given a novelty gift that a third grader would make for Father's Day was hilarious. I laughed too, but it was the fake laugh, the one where your teeth stay clenched and your eyes don't move. I could feel my face getting hot, not because I was embarrassed for myself, though I was, but because I could tell they really thought this was fine. They honestly believed that giving my brother a car and me a stack of sarcastic IOUs on my birthday was somehow okay. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about the car or the envelope. It was about the years of being overlooked, the years of hearing, we can't afford that, when I asked for something reasonable, while they wrote check after check to bail Kyle out of his screw-ups. It was about every time I'd been told to be proud of your brother when he did something half-decent, and every time my own accomplishments were brushed off with, well, you've always been responsible, so we don't need to worry about you. I didn't say anything right then, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that snapping in the moment only gives them a reason to call me ungrateful or dramatic. No, I smiled, I thanked them. I even made a joke about how now I could cash in for that home-cooked meal sometime in the next decade. And inside, I started making a mental list, not of the things I wanted, but of the ways I could make sure they understood, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was the last time they would humiliate me like that. You know that moment in a poker game where someone bets big because they think they've already won, and they don't realize you've been holding your cards close the whole time? That's where I was standing in that room, letting them believe they'd set the tone, when in reality, they'd just given me the perfect reason to finally play my hand. I kept replaying the scene in my head all night, the applause, the you deserve it, the smirk on Kyle's face when he slid into the driver's seat right there in the driveway so everyone could hear the engine roar. My parents standing beside him like proud sponsors of some local celebrity, while I stood a few feet away, clutching my envelope like it was a participation ribbon. And the more I replayed it, the calmer I got. Because I knew, without a shred of doubt, that they had no idea what kind of door they'd just opened. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew it would be smart, it would be quiet, and it would be something they couldn't spin into another one of their Aaron's just being sensitive stories. This wouldn't be a shouting match at the dinner table. This would be the kind of lesson they'd feel every single day afterward. That envelope wasn't just an insult, it was the spark. And as I tucked it into my purse before I left that night, I already knew I was going to keep it. Not because I wanted the damn coupons, but because one day, when this was all over, I'd hand it back to them. And they'd know exactly why. The thing about moments like that birthday fiasco is they don't just come out of nowhere. They're the result of years, sometimes decades, of little choices and patterns that stack up until one day you look around and realize you've been living in an unspoken arrangement where one person's needs, mistakes, and ambitions are always prioritized over your own, and you've been trained to accept it as normal. If you've never been in that position, you might think I'm exaggerating, but anyone who's lived it knows that favoritism in a family doesn't show up in just one big event. It's in 1,000 smaller ones that get brushed off as no big deal, until they've shaped the entire dynamic. For as long as I can remember, Kyle has been the one my parents worried about, talked about, and planned around. When we were kids, if he forgot his homework, there was a long, sympathetic conversation about how school just isn't his thing, and maybe his teachers were being too hard on him, whereas if I ever forgot mine, it was somehow proof that I was getting lazy and needed to try harder because I was capable of so much more. When he wrecked his first car at 17, a car they had bought for him, of course, they were devastated for him, talking about how unlucky he was and how these things happened to everyone, while I, who had been saving every tip from my part-time job just to buy an ancient used Honda, got a lecture about being careful on the road, as though I was the reckless one. And when I was accepted into college on a scholarship I'd worked my tail off for, they told me they were proud, sure, but it came with a shrug and a quick pivot to discussing how Kyle might need to take a gap year to figure himself out, which was code for we'll be covering his bills until he decides to do something. That pattern followed us well into adulthood. I bought my own condo at 29, which should have been a huge deal for them, but when I called to tell them, they congratulated me, asked how much I'd put down, and then, without missing a beat, switched the conversation to how Kyle's latest business idea, flipping used motorcycles, might finally be the one that worked for him. I've been hearing some version of that line my whole life, each new scheme being the one that would make him successful, even though every single one has ended with my parents quietly covering his losses. And I don't mean just small losses. I mean thousands of dollars here, a personal loan there, even co-signing for things they would have laughed in my face if I'd ever asked for. The week after my birthday, when the sting of that envelope was still fresh, Kyle came over to my place, supposedly just to hang out, but really to brag about his latest, can't-miss opportunity. This time it was cars specifically, buying them at auction, cleaning up the paperwork, his words, not mine, and reselling them at a massive profit. He talked about it like it was practically free money, throwing around numbers that didn't sound realistic even before I started asking questions. The more he explained, the more I realized that cleaning up the paperwork was just a nice way of saying he was skating the edges of what's legal, and the fact that he said it so casually told me he'd been doing things like this for a while. Naturally, my parents were ecstatic. This is exactly the kind of drive we've always known he had, my mom said, like watching him scroll Craigslist for beat-up sedans was the same as building a tech startup. Dad chimed in with, "You should be proud of your brother, Aaron," and I had to physically bite my tongue to stop myself from saying, proud of what, exactly? That he's one bad decision away from a criminal charge. But I didn't say it, because that would have just turned into another lecture about how I always see the negative when it comes to Kyle. Instead, I nodded. I asked a few casual questions about how he was funding all these purchases, and that's when he let it slip, without even realizing what he was admitting, that Mom and Dad had helped out with the startup costs, which, knowing them, probably meant they'd given him more than I've ever seen them spend on me in one sitting. He said it like it was no big deal, like of course they would invest in him, because that's what they do. And while I kept my face neutral, inside I felt something click into place. That one comment, thrown out between bites of takeout pizza, was the first real opening I'd seen in years. If they were financially tied to his little side hustle, then whatever happened to him in that business was going to ripple directly into their lives. It wasn't just his neck on the line, it was theirs. And that was the first time I saw the possibility of shifting the balance, not by confronting them or having some big emotional blowout, but by letting them experience firsthand what it feels like when the person you've put all your faith in lets you down. I knew I couldn't rush it. If I was going to turn this situation into something they couldn't ignore or dismiss, I had to be patient, I had to be smart, and most importantly, I had to make sure that when things started to unravel, I would look like the one person in the family who had been steady and reasonable all along. So I smiled, I wished him luck, and I told him if he ever needed a hand with paperwork or keeping track of sales, I'd be happy to help. He grinned, thinking I was finally on his side, and that's when I knew I'd already taken the first step. Once I had decided that I was going to use this little business venture of Kyle's as my leverage, I knew I couldn't just jump in and start making moves, because with my parents, any direct challenge to their golden boy would be met with instant defensiveness, followed by the kind of family drama that drains your energy before you can even get to the point. What I needed was a way to get inside his operation without raising suspicion, and the easiest path to that was to play the role he had always wanted me to play, the supportive sister who believed in his vision, no matter how shaky the foundation was. That meant listening without judgment, offering help in a way that made it seem like I was on his team, and above all, keeping my real thoughts to myself until it was too late for him to do anything about it. It wasn't hard to find my opening. Kyle, for all his bravado, is the kind of person who loves to talk about his own genius, and once you get him going, he'll happily hand over details that a more cautious person would keep close to the vest. Over lunch a week later, I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about doing some investing myself and that I'd love to learn more about how he was managing his deals. That was all it took. Suddenly, I was looking at spreadsheets on his laptop, listening to him explain his process in a way that was so sloppy it made my skin crawl. There were missing invoices, half-completed bills of sale, and a shocking amount of cash transactions with nothing but vague notes to track them. He thought this was just normal hustle, but I saw it for what it was, a mess waiting to collapse under its own weight. The more I looked, the more I realized that this wasn't just about him making questionable choices, it was about the way my parents had enabled it. I could see deposits from their account, some labeled as loan and others as gift, which told me they weren't even bothering to disguise the fact that they were bankrolling him. If one of those deals went south, it wouldn't just be Kyle scrambling to cover the loss, it would be Mom and Dad right there with him, tied to the wreckage. And that was exactly the kind of leverage I needed, because for once, his reckless behavior wasn't something they could write off as just a learning experience, without taking a direct hit themselves. I kept my tone light, making little comments about how I could help him tighten things up so it would be easier to track profits, and he was thrilled, thinking I was genuinely impressed by his work. I offered to set up a shared folder for his documents, told him I could create a simple system to keep everything organized, and within days I had access to every contract, receipt, and communication he'd had with buyers. He never questioned my motives because it had never occurred to him that I might be capable of playing the same kind of game he'd been running his whole life. But while he thought I was cleaning up his business, what I was really doing was mapping every weak point. I made note of the cars that didn't have proper titles, the buyers who were already annoyed at delays, and the deals where he'd promised delivery dates that were impossible to meet. And just to make sure I had a complete picture, I cross-referenced his accounts with my parents' bank transfers, so I could see exactly how deep their involvement ran. Every new discovery was like another piece falling into place in a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years, the puzzle of how to make them all see, in undeniable terms, that blind loyalty has a price. It would have been easy to blow it all up right then, to show my parents the documents and watch the fallout, but that would have been short-term satisfaction, and I was aiming for something that would stick. If I just confronted them, they'd rally around him, bail him out again, and somehow find a way to make me the villain for not supporting my brother. No, the smarter play was to wait until he'd built the perfect storm all on his own, and then make sure they were standing right there with him when it hit. That way, when the damage landed, it wouldn't be something they could separate themselves from. They'd feel it in their wallets, their pride, and their carefully crafted story about how Kyle was finally making it. So I kept helping, asking questions that seemed innocent but were really designed to push him toward riskier moves. I'd point out potential deals that looked good on paper but were more complicated than he realized, knowing he'd jump at the chance to make a bigger profit without thinking through the consequences. And each time he did, I was right there, taking notes, quietly tightening the noose he didn't even know was around his neck. I remember sitting across from him one afternoon while he bragged about a particularly big deal he had lined up, watching the excitement in his face as he talked about how much he was going to make, and thinking, "You have no idea that you're building your own downfall, brick by brick." And the best part was, I didn't have to push him hard, just a nudge here, a suggestion there, because Kyle's greatest weakness has always been his belief that he's smarter than everyone else. All I had to do was let him think he was outsmarting me, and he practically handed me the ammunition. By the end of that month, I had everything I needed: proof of shady practices, evidence of my parents' financial involvement, and a timeline that showed exactly when and how the cracks in his business would start to show. All that was left was to wait for the right moment, and I knew it was coming sooner than he thought, because Kyle was already bragging about a deal so overextended that even a small hiccup could bring the whole thing crashing down. And when that happened, I'd be ready, not to save him, but to make sure that for the first time in our lives, my parents would have to face the consequences of betting everything on their favorite child. The thing about people like Kyle is that you rarely have to take them down directly, because their overconfidence and lack of foresight will eventually do the work for you, provided you're patient enough to step back, watch, and make sure the stage is set so that when the inevitable collapse happens, it's witnessed by exactly the right people. By the time I'd been helping him for a few weeks, I had a clear sense of just how fragile his so-called business was, and I knew the moment would come when he'd overreach. Not just because he wanted to, but because he couldn't help himself. He thrives on the rush of thinking he's scored a big win, and like every gambler who's convinced the next hand will change his life, he's always willing to push a little further than he can afford. I started feeding the fire in subtle ways, never telling him what to do outright, but making little comments about how impressive it would be if he could land something bigger, how it would really show the haters, and yes, I was one of those supposed haters. But he was too wrapped up in the fantasy of proving himself to see that. He began chasing larger deals, the kind that required more capital than he realistically had, which, of course, meant going back to my parents for temporary funding. I knew that was exactly what they'd do, open their checkbook without a second thought, because to them, every dollar given to Kyle was an investment in his future, and every dollar withheld from me was teaching me the value of independence. The hypocrisy was so baked into our family's DNA that they couldn't even see it anymore. One afternoon, I made an offhand remark about a contact I'd heard was looking to unload a few vehicles quickly for cash, knowing that the deal sounded too good to be true, because it was. It wasn't illegal, but it was messy, involving multiple owners and incomplete paperwork, the kind of deal that could take months to sort out properly, but that Kyle would think he could flip in a matter of weeks. I didn't have to push. He jumped on it like a shark spotting blood in the water, calling my parents that same night to tell them this was the one that would double their money. And predictably, they believed him, telling him how proud they were and reminding him that not everyone gets these kinds of opportunities, which in their language meant, "We'll cover you if it goes wrong." The beauty of it was that I didn't need to sabotage anything directly. All I had to do was give him the rope, and he did the rest, overcommitting himself financially, making promises to buyers he couldn't keep, and leaning harder and harder on my parents to float him until the big payoff arrived. Meanwhile, I quietly made sure that one of the more meticulous buyers he was dealing with, someone who cared deeply about proper paperwork and legitimate transactions, got just enough information to start asking the kind of questions Kyle hated to answer. It wasn't about creating a scandal. It was about setting in motion a chain of events that would make his own shortcuts visible, not just to me, but to anyone paying attention. It didn't take long before the cracks began to show. The buyer started demanding updates Kyle couldn't provide, threatening to walk away from the deal altogether. I could see the tension in his face when he called me, trying to act like it was just a small hiccup, but already fishing for ways I might help him smooth it over. I pretended to be sympathetic, told him I'd see what I could do, and then did absolutely nothing except wait for him to dig himself in deeper. And he did, because instead of cutting his losses, Kyle did what he always does, doubled down, promising the buyer everything would be sorted within days, even though the documents he needed didn't exist yet. By the end of that week, he was in a full-blown panic. My parents, of course, were still in denial, insisting it was just a misunderstanding and that their son would never mismanage anything so badly. They clung to that belief even as the numbers stopped adding up, even as the buyer threatened to pull the plug entirely, and even as Kyle started calling me almost daily with half-baked plans to fix the situation. I gave him just enough advice to keep him thinking I was on his side, but every piece of guidance I offered was designed to stall, not solve. The call that told me the plan was finally peaking came late one night. Kyle's voice was tight, desperate, the bravado gone, as he admitted he couldn't cover the costs without another cash injection from Mom and Dad, who were suddenly hesitating because they'd already given him more than they were comfortable admitting to anyone else. He needed me to talk to them, to explain the situation in a way that would convince them it was worth backing him one more time. That was the moment I'd been waiting for, the point where I held the power, where my parents' blind faith in him and his blind belief in himself had converged into one massive, unsustainable mess. I didn't give him an answer right away. I told him I'd think about it, which in reality meant I was planning exactly how and when I was going to bring every single piece of evidence I'd been gathering to the table. Because this wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about making sure that, for the first time in my life, the story couldn't be twisted, the facts couldn't be ignored, and the golden boy couldn't be rescued without my cooperation. And I knew, when that meeting happened, I wouldn't be offering cooperation, I'd be offering a choice they'd never imagined they'd have to make. When the call finally came from my parents asking me to come over because we all need to sit down and talk about Kyle's situation, I knew the stage was perfectly set. And the best part was that they still thought this meeting was going to be about me stepping in to help clean up his mess. I could hear it in my mother's voice, that tone she uses when she's trying to sound calm but is actually panicking, the same one I've heard 100 times before whenever Kyle's schemes start to unravel. Except this time, instead of rushing over in rescue mode or offering advice to help them spin the story, I took my time, made myself a coffee, and walked in with the calm certainty of someone who has already decided exactly how the conversation will end. They were all at the kitchen table when I arrived, Mom looking tense, Dad doing that thing where he stares at his folded hands instead of making eye contact, and Kyle looking like a man who's been caught halfway through building a house of cards right before someone opens a window. He launched into his version of events before I'd even sat down, talking fast, throwing out excuses about how the buyer was being unreasonable, how the paperwork delays weren't his fault, and how this whole thing could be turned around if everyone just stayed supportive. I didn't interrupt, because I wanted him to think he still had the floor, to let him dig as deep as possible before I started pulling out the shovels he'd buried himself with. When he finally ran out of breath, my parents jumped in with their usual chorus about how these things happen and we can all work together to figure it out, which was my cue. I pulled out a neatly organized folder from my bag, the one containing every document, transaction record, and timeline I'd been collecting since the day I offered to help with his business. I placed it in the middle of the table, opened it slowly, and began walking them through the reality of the situation in a voice so calm it probably unnerved them more than if I'd been yelling. I pointed out the cars without proper titles, the mismatched dates on bills of sale, the money they had wired to him that had gone straight to cover unrelated debts, and the string of promises to buyers that had no chance of being fulfilled. I didn't embellish anything or make accusations, I simply laid out the facts in a way that left no room for interpretation. I could see the shift happening in their faces as I spoke. Mom's color drained a little, Dad's frown deepened, and even Kyle stopped fidgeting long enough to realize that I wasn't guessing or speculating. I had receipts, both literal and metaphorical. I told them very plainly that they were at a crossroads. They could keep backing him, pour even more of their own money into a situation that was already circling the drain, and hope for a miracle that wasn't coming, or they could pull out now, cut their losses, and face the uncomfortable truth that the golden boy wasn't just having a rough patch, he was running a disaster they had helped create. There was a long silence after that, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you aware of every tiny sound in the room. Kyle started to protest, of course, insisting that I was making it sound worse than it was, but I just looked at him, steady and unblinking, and said, "This isn't me making it sound anyway. This is me showing you exactly what you've been doing and exactly where it's gotten you." And then I turned my eyes back to my parents, because the truth was, this was never just about him. It was about them finally being forced to acknowledge that their blind loyalty had consequences. When they finally spoke, it was Dad who broke the silence, clearing his throat before saying, in a voice that was quieter than I'd expected, that they couldn't give him any more money. Mom nodded, her lips pressed so tightly together I thought she might start crying, but she didn't. Kyle stared at them, then at me, and for a brief moment, I could see it register, that this was the first time in his life they weren't going to swoop in and save him. He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but whatever he saw in my face must have told him it was pointless. I didn't gloat, because that wasn't the point. Instead, I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out the envelope they'd given me on my birthday, the ridiculous coupon book still inside. I slid it across the table toward them and said, "You can keep this. I won't be needing it." There was no anger in my voice, no sarcasm, just finality, the kind that comes when you've already walked yourself out of a role you were never meant to play. I stood up, told them I hoped they'd figure out whatever they needed to figure out, and walked out the door without looking back. And in that moment, I realized the real birthday gift I'd given myself wasn't just exposing the truth or watching them face the fallout, it was finally stepping out of the family dynamic that had kept me boxed in for my entire life. I didn't need their validation, their approval, or even their understanding anymore, because I'd proven, at least to myself, that I could change the game without playing by their rules. They might still see Kyle as the one who needed them, and they might still find ways to excuse what had happened, but they'd never be able to forget the day I put the truth in front of them and refused to carry it for them. And that, more than anything, was worth more than any car, any check, or any hollow gesture wrapped in an envelope. It was the moment I stopped being the supporting character in a story I hadn't written and started being the author of my own.